My HOA president walked into the meeting with security footage and a smirk. But after the board asked him one simple question, his whole scam unraveled. 4 months ago, I walked onto my property after work and froze. The HOA president, Mr. Davidson, was in my backyard with a measuring tape, spray painting lines on my garden. This was the 3rd time this month. "What are you doing?" I asked. He didn't even look up. "Your garden violates HOA guidelines. It's 2 inches over the property line." "I had this surveyed. It's within my property." He laughed. "I don't care what your survey says. I'm the HOA president." That night, I installed security cameras and sent him a cease and desist letter. He responded immediately. "My apologies. You're correct. This won't happen again." For a week, he stayed away. Then I woke up to find violation notices plastered all over my house. 17 violations, each with a $500 fine. Total, $8,500. The violations were insane. Grass blade height inconsistent. Mailbox paint shade incorrect. Breathing too loudly after 10 p.m. Yes, really. I hired a lawyer and we contested the fines. That's when Davidson got nasty. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he texted. "I've destroyed homeowners before." The HOA meeting was in 2 weeks. I prepared everything. Photos proving the violations were fabricated, survey documents, even testimony from neighbors. I walked into the meeting confident. This was going to be easy, until I saw Davidson with his laptop, grinning like he'd already won. He stood up first. "Before we discuss the fines, I have evidence of major violations by Ms. Bray." He opened his laptop and showed security footage to the board. "This is Ms. Bray running an illegal business from her home. Look, multiple deliveries daily, customers coming and going, commercial activity in a residential zone." The board members gasped. Running a business from home was a $25,000 fine plus immediate eviction from the neighborhood. "This is footage from last Tuesday," Davidson continued, "and Wednesday, and Thursday. Clear commercial activity." Board member Mrs. Williams studied the footage. "Mr. Davidson, this is concerning. When did you obtain this footage?" "Over the past 2 weeks, documenting her illegal activities." Mrs. Williams zoomed in on the video. "This is quite detailed. You can see inside her home through the windows." "Yes, I was thorough in my investigation. I can even see into her bedroom in this shot." Davidson nodded proudly. "I documented everything." Mrs. Williams set down the laptop. "Mr. Davidson, where exactly were you standing when you recorded this?" Davidson's smile flickered. "Various locations." "But this angle, you'd have to be on Miss Bray's property to get this footage. Were you?" Silence. "Mr. Davidson, did you trespass on private property to obtain this recording?" It's for HOA enforcement. Yes or no? Were you on her property?" Davidson's face went red. "The HOA president has authority." "The HOA president does not have authority to trespass and secretly record residents in their homes," Mrs. Williams said coldly. "That's stalking. That's illegal surveillance." I stood up. "I have security footage too. It shows Mr. Davidson on my property at 2 a.m. with recording equipment. Multiple times." The board members looked horrified. "There's more," I continued. "I discovered Mr. Davidson has been issuing fake fines to fund his gambling debts. I have evidence of 43 homeowners who paid violations that don't exist in HOA bylaws." Davidson tried to run, but security blocked the exit. Mrs. Williams called the police. "We need officers here immediately." As they arrested Davidson, he screamed something that made everyone gasp. "Check Williams' house. She's been helping me. We split the money 50-50. Mrs. Williams went pale. "That's a lie." But when police checked her phone, they found Venmo transactions from Davidson totaling $340,000 over 3 years. I stood frozen while 2 officers pulled Davidson toward the exit, his voice getting louder with each step. Williams tried to follow quietly, but another officer blocked her path and reached for her arm. The room exploded into noise. People jumped out of their chairs shouting questions about their money. A man near the front demanded to know how much he'd paid for fake violations. Someone else yelled about getting lawyers involved. The remaining 3 board members pressed against the back wall looking like they wanted to disappear through it. One of them, a thin woman in a blue sweater, kept shaking her head and saying she didn't know anything about any fraud. The officers led Davidson and Williams through the doorway into the hall. Their voices faded, but the chaos in the room got worse. People crowded around the front table where my evidence folders sat open. A woman grabbed one and started flipping through pages. Another man picked up the spreadsheet I'd made listing all 43 victims. He scanned down the page with his finger, then looked up at me with wide eyes. Detective Morse appeared beside me and touched my elbow. He asked if I could stay behind after everyone cleared out. His voice was calm, but his eyes tracked the crowd like he expected someone to start throwing punches. I nodded and stepped back against the wall while he moved to the front of the room. He raised both hands and asked everyone to settle down. The noise dropped a little. He explained that officers would be contacting each victim individually to take statements. He said people should go home and gather any documentation they had about fines they'd paid. The crowd started moving toward the door, but slowly, like nobody wanted to leave without answers. A few people stopped near me and asked if I was the one who figured it all out. I said yes, and they thanked me, their voices shaky. One older man squeezed my shoulder and said I'd done the neighborhood a real service. 20 minutes passed before the last person left. The 3 remaining board members tried to slip out with everyone else, but Detective Morse asked them to wait in the hall. They looked terrified. Detective Morse pulled a chair over and asked me to sit down. He took out a small notebook and clicked his pen. He wanted my full statement about everything Davidson had done on my property. I pulled out my phone and opened the security camera app. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. He noticed and told me to take my time. I showed him the first video from 3 weeks ago. Davidson appeared on my back patio at 2 in the morning carrying what looked like a camera on a tripod. He set it up pointing at my bedroom window and adjusted the angle. The timestamp showed he stayed there for 40 minutes. Detective Morse leaned closer to watch. I swiped to the next video from 5 days later. Same thing, different angle. This time Davidson positioned his camera to see into my living room. I had 7 more videos just like them. Detective Morse wrote notes between each one. He asked if Davidson had ever threatened me directly. I showed him the text message where Davidson said he'd destroyed homeowners before. Detective Morse took pictures of my phone screen with his own phone. He asked about the fake fines and how I'd discovered the fraud. I explained how I'd requested copies of the actual HOA bylaws from the county and compared them to the violations Davidson had issued. None of the section numbers matched. Some of the bylaws he cited didn't exist at all. Detective Morse nodded and wrote faster. He said they'd search Davidson's home office tonight and I should expect more questions tomorrow. I drove home around midnight with my brain buzzing too loud to think straight. Every streetlight seemed too bright. My hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. I kept replaying Williams's face when they found those Venmo transactions on her phone. She'd looked shocked at first, then resigned, like she'd known this day would come eventually. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the dark car for a minute. My phone screen lit up with a notification, then another, then 5 more in quick succession. I opened the Messages app and stared at 17 unread texts from numbers I didn't recognize. The first one asked if I was the woman who exposed the HOA fraud. The second wanted to know if I could help get money back. The third said their family had paid over $4,000 in fake fines, and they had 3 kids to feed. I scrolled through them all. Every single person wanted the same thing: help recovering money Davidson had stolen. Some of them lived 3 streets over, and I'd never met them once. A woman named Selena said she'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone she'd paid fines for having the wrong shade of white on her garage door. A man named Robert wrote that Davidson had threatened to foreclose on his house if he didn't pay immediately. My phone buzzed again with number 18. I turned it off and went inside. The next morning, someone knocked on my front door before I'd finished my coffee. I looked through the peephole and saw a woman about 60 years old holding a thick folder. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying. I opened the door and she introduced herself as Cheryl Emerson. She lived 4 houses down and had paid Davidson for violations over the past 2 years. Her voice cracked when she said the total amount: $6,500. She was a retired teacher living on her pension and Social Security. That money was supposed to cover her property taxes for 3 years. Now it was gone and she didn't know how she'd manage. I invited her inside and we sat at my kitchen table. She opened her folder and pulled out violation notices printed on official HOA letterhead. The first one cited her fence height as 3 inches over regulation. The second said her mailbox placement violated setback requirements. The third claimed her house paint color wasn't on the approved list, even though it was the same beige the previous owners had used for 20 years. Each notice included a fine amount and a deadline. Each one threatened legal action if she didn't pay immediately. Cheryl had paid every single one within days of receiving it. She said Davidson had always been so nice about it, apologizing for having to enforce the rules, but explaining that his hands were tied by the bylaws. We spent 3 hours going through her paperwork. I pulled up the actual HOA bylaws on my laptop, and we compared them line by line to Davidson's citations. None of her violations existed in the real rules. The fence height regulation Davidson cited was from Section 4. 7, but the real Section 4. 7 was about holiday decorations. The mailbox placement rule supposedly came from Section 8. 2, but Section 8. 2 covered swimming pool maintenance. Some of the section numbers Davidson had written didn't exist at all. The bylaws only went up to Section 12, but he'd cited Sections 15, 18, and 22. Cheryl stared at the screen with her mouth open. She asked how he'd gotten away with it for so long. I said he'd probably counted on people not checking the actual rules. Most homeowners just assumed the HOA president knew what he was talking about. We found a pattern in the dates, too. Davidson had sent violation notices in clusters, usually 5 or 6 different homeowners in the same week. Then he'd wait a month or two before sending the next batch. It made each violation seem like an isolated incident instead of part of a systematic fraud. Cheryl's hands shook as she stacked her papers back into the folder. She thanked me for taking the time to help her understand what had happened. I told her we'd figure out how to get her money back. My phone rang that afternoon while I was trying to catch up on work emails. Detective Morse's name appeared on the screen. I answered, and he said they'd executed a search warrant on Davidson's house that morning. They'd found his home office packed with evidence. Spreadsheets tracking every fake fine he'd issued over 3 years. Notes about which homeowners were easy targets who wouldn't question his authority. Bank statements showing deposits that matched the fine amounts exactly. Detective Morse said Davidson had been incredibly organized about his fraud, which would make the prosecution's job easier. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. They'd found a list of homeowners Davidson considered problems. My name was at the top with a star next to it, and a note that said, "Stubborn, requires pressure." Below that were details about my work schedule, the times I usually came home, and which windows in my house had the best sightlines. Detective Morse said the stalking charges were going to be serious. He asked if I felt safe at home. I said yes, but I wasn't sure that was true anymore. He told me to call immediately if anything seemed off, or if I noticed anyone watching my house. I promised I would and hung up. I spent an hour searching online for lawyers who handled HOA disputes before I found Raphael Wyatt's website. His practice focused on homeowner rights and fraud recovery. I called his office and explained the situation to his assistant. She put me on hold, then came back and said Raphael could see me tomorrow afternoon. I drove downtown the next day and found his office on the 3rd floor of an old building near the courthouse. Raphael was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with glasses and a friendly smile. He listened while I explained everything about Davidson and Williams and the 43 victims. He took notes on a yellow legal pad and asked questions about the evidence. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said the criminal case was straightforward. The prosecutors had everything they needed for convictions, but getting the money back would be much harder. Davidson had gambling debts and probably spent most of what he'd stolen. Williams had been smarter about hiding her share, but tracking it down would take months. Raphael said we could file civil suits against both of them and put liens on any assets they had left. We might recover 30 or 40 cents on the dollar if we were lucky. Most victims would lose most of their money permanently. I asked what we should do next. Raphael said he'd organize a meeting for all the victims to explain their options. He'd need a week to review all the evidence and prepare. I agreed and left feeling both relieved and frustrated. Raphael called 5 days later and said he'd reserved the community center for a victim meeting. He wanted me there to answer questions about how I'd discovered the fraud. I said I'd come, but I really just wanted to hide in my house and never deal with HOA drama again. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening at 7. I showed up at 6:45 and found the parking lot already full. Inside, people packed the main room. Every chair was taken and more people stood along the walls. I recognized some faces from the neighborhood, but most were strangers. Raphael stood at the front setting up his laptop and projector. He saw me and waved me over. He asked if I'd be willing to share my story about catching Davidson. I said okay, even though my mouth felt dry. At 7 exactly, Raphael started the presentation. He explained that criminal charges were proceeding against Davidson and Williams, but that didn't automatically mean victims would get their money back. The criminal restitution process could take years. Filing separate civil suits would be faster but more expensive. People started shouting questions before he finished his second slide. Someone demanded to know why they couldn't just take everything Davidson owned. Raphael explained that Davidson's house had 3 mortgages and his cars were leased. His bank accounts showed a balance of $800 total. The gambling debts had consumed everything. The room erupted into angry voices. A man near the front stood up and yelled that this was unacceptable. A woman behind me said she'd paid $9,000 and couldn't afford to lose it. Raphael raised his hands and asked everyone to let him finish. He explained that Williams had been more careful with her share. She'd transferred most of it to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Tracing and recovering that money would require hiring forensic accountants and international lawyers. The process could take 18 months and cost tens of thousands in legal fees. Even then, they might only recover a fraction of what she'd hidden. Someone asked how much money they could realistically expect to get back. Raphael said if they were very lucky and very patient, maybe 25% of what they'd paid. The room went quiet. Then a man in the back row stood up. I recognized him from 3 houses down on Maple Street. His name was Peterson. He pointed at me and said this was all my fault. He said if I hadn't exposed the fraud, at least they wouldn't know they'd been robbed. At least they could have gone on thinking their money went to legitimate fines. Now they knew the truth, and there was nothing they could do about it. Several people started yelling at Peterson. A woman told him he was being ridiculous. Cheryl stood up from her seat near the front and told Peterson to sit down and shut up. Her voice was loud and firm. Peterson looked around at all the angry faces staring at him. He sat down without saying anything else. I caught Cheryl's eye and mouthed, "Thank you." She nodded and gave me a small smile. Raphael cleared his throat and continued his presentation. I appreciated Cheryl defending me more than she probably knew. After Raphael finished his presentation and answered the last few questions, people started gathering their folders and heading toward the exit. I stayed in my seat watching them leave in small groups, talking quietly among themselves. Cheryl walked over to where I was sitting and sat down in the chair next to me. She asked if I had a few minutes to talk. I said sure. 3 other people came over and formed a small circle around us. One was an older man named Mr. Henderson who lived on Oak Street. Another was a woman in her 30s named Maria, who I'd seen at the neighborhood pool. The third was a guy around my age named Tom, who I didn't know at all. Cheryl explained that they'd been talking during the break and wanted to ask me something. She said Raphael mentioned I was the one who organized all the evidence that exposed Davidson and Williams. She asked if I'd be willing to help coordinate the victim group for the civil case. I felt my stomach drop. I told them I wasn't good at organizing people or running groups. Maria said they just needed someone who understood the documentation and could keep track of everything. Tom added that Raphael said he'd need a point person to collect information from all 43 victims and make sure nothing got lost. Mr. Henderson said they'd all help with whatever I needed. They just wanted someone reliable in charge who actually cared about getting their money back. I looked at their faces and saw how tired they all seemed. These people had been dealing with Davidson's harassment for years. They'd paid money they couldn't afford to lose. Cheryl had cried in my kitchen about her retirement savings. I couldn't say no, even though the idea of organizing 43 people made me want to hide under my bed. I agreed to do it. Cheryl smiled and squeezed my hand. Maria said she'd start calling people tomorrow to get their contact information. Tom offered to help create a shared folder for documents. Mr. Henderson said he'd talk to the other older residents who might not be comfortable with email. We spent 20 minutes making a basic plan before everyone headed home. I drove back to my house feeling exhausted and slightly sick about what I'd just agreed to do. Detective Morse called me the next afternoon while I was making lunch. He said he had an update about the investigation. Williams had decided to cooperate with the prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence. She'd handed over bank statements and records showing exactly how she and Davidson split the stolen money over 3 years. I asked if that meant we'd get the money back. He was quiet for a second. Then he explained that Davidson had lost almost all of his share gambling. The records showed he'd withdrawn huge amounts of cash and lost it at casinos in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. Out of the roughly $170,000 he'd taken, only about $800 remained in his accounts. Williams had been smarter about hiding hers. She'd kept some in regular accounts but transferred most of it offshore. The prosecutors had frozen about $35,000 in accounts they could access immediately. The rest was tied up in places that would take months or years to track down if they could track it at all. I asked what that meant for the victims. Detective Morse said most people would probably lose most of their money permanently. Even if they won judgments against Davidson and Williams in civil court, you can't get blood from a stone. Davidson was broke and Williams had hidden everything too well. I thanked him for the update and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table staring at my sandwich without eating it. 43 people were counting on me to help them recover their money. Most of them would be lucky to get back 20 or 30 cents on every dollar they'd lost. Some of them had paid thousands of dollars they desperately needed. I thought about Cheryl crying over her $6,500. I thought about how I'd just promised to coordinate everything. I felt completely overwhelmed. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the victims and how much work organizing them would be. Around 11, I gave up on sleeping and opened my laptop. I created a new spreadsheet and started entering information. I went through all the evidence Detective Morse had shared with Raphael. I listed each victim's name in one column. In the next column, I put the total amount they'd paid in fake fines. Then I added columns for dates and violation types. Some people had paid multiple times over several years. Others had only paid once, but the amounts were huge. I cross-referenced everything with the documents Detective Morse had collected during his investigation. Several times I found discrepancies where the amounts didn't match up. I made notes to follow up on those cases. By midnight, my eyes were burning from staring at the screen, but I kept going. I wanted this spreadsheet to be perfect. These people deserved to have their information organized properly. Someone needed to document exactly what had been stolen from them, even if they'd never get it back. I added formulas to calculate totals and averages. I created filters so we could sort by amount or date. I made a separate tab for notes about each case. Around 2 in the morning, I finally finished. The spreadsheet showed that 43 victims had paid a total of $341,200 in fraudulent fines over 3 years. The amounts ranged from $850 to $14,500. The average victim had lost about $7,900. I saved the file and backed it up in 3 different places. Then I sent a copy to Raphael with a note explaining what I'd done. I fell asleep at my desk with my head on my arms. My phone woke me up at 7:30 the next morning. It was Maria calling to say she'd started collecting contact information from other victims. She'd already talked to 15 people and they all wanted to be part of the civil case. I told her that was great and asked her to email me the list. After we hung up, I made coffee and checked my email. Raphael had responded to my spreadsheet message. He said the organization was excellent and exactly what he needed. He also said he had concerning news. 2 of the remaining HOA board members had quietly resigned overnight. Their resignation letters had been slipped under his office door sometime before his secretary arrived that morning. Both letters were identical and said they were resigning for personal reasons effective immediately. Raphael said this made him very suspicious. These 2 board members had claimed they knew nothing about Davidson and Williams' fraud. But resigning suddenly the day after the criminal charges became public seemed like the behavior of people who were guilty of something. He said we needed to investigate their possible involvement before they disappeared completely. I wrote back asking what he wanted me to do. He responded 10 minutes later saying he'd already filed a request with Detective Morse to look into their financial records. He wanted me to start asking around the neighborhood about whether anyone had noticed suspicious behavior from these 2 board members. Their names were Gerald Schaffer and Selena Hayes. I'd never spoken to either of them. I finished my coffee and got dressed. Then I called Cheryl and asked if she'd help me interview neighbors about the board members. She said yes immediately. Cheryl and I spent the entire next week going door to door talking to people. We started with houses on my street and worked our way through the neighborhood. Most people were happy to talk once we explained what we were doing. Several remembered specific incidents that seemed suspicious now that we were looking for patterns. A woman on Birch Lane said Gerald Schaffer had completely renovated his kitchen 2 years ago. She remembered because the construction was loud and went on for weeks. She'd asked him how he could afford such an expensive remodel on a teacher's salary. He'd told her he'd gotten an inheritance from an uncle. Another neighbor said Selena Hayes had bought a new Lexus 18 months ago. She'd bragged about it at a neighborhood barbecue. When someone asked how she afforded it, she'd said her consulting business was doing really well. But nobody could figure out what kind of consulting she actually did. We collected dozens of stories like this. Cheryl kept detailed notes on her tablet. After 5 days, we had enough information to see a clear pattern. Both Gerald and Selena had made major purchases or home improvements at specific times. When we compared the dates to my spreadsheet of fake finds, we found something disturbing. Gerald's kitchen renovation happened right after Davidson issued a huge batch of violation notices in March 2 years ago. Selena's car purchase came right after another big wave of fines in September the year before that. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. We took our findings to Raphael. He studied Cheryl's notes for a long time without saying anything. Then he asked if we'd be willing to sign affidavits about what we'd discovered. We both said yes. He told us he'd file a motion to freeze Gerald and Selena's assets immediately. Raphael called me 3 days later to say the judge had granted a temporary asset freeze on both Gerald Schaffer and Selena Hayes. The judge agreed that the timing of their purchases and their sudden resignations suggested possible involvement in the fraud. Detective Morse had also gotten approval to add them to his investigation. He'd already started pulling their bank records and credit card statements. Raphael said this was good news, but we shouldn't get our hopes up. Even if Gerald and Selena were involved, they might not have much money left either. I asked what would happen next. He said Detective Morse would need a few weeks to go through all the financial records. If he found evidence connecting them to the fraud scheme, the prosecutor would file additional criminal charges. In the meantime, the temporary freeze meant they couldn't sell their houses or move any major assets. I thanked Raphael and hung up. Then I updated my spreadsheet with notes about Gerald and Selena's potential involvement. I was starting to feel like maybe we had a chance of recovering at least some of the stolen money. The HOA sent out an email announcement about an emergency election. They needed to fill all the empty board positions since Davidson, Williams, Gerald, and Selena were all gone. The election would be held in 2 weeks at the community center. Anyone who wanted to run for the board needed to submit their name by the end of the week. I read the email and felt relieved that someone else would have to deal with fixing the HOA mess. 3 days before the deadline, Cheryl called me. She said nobody had submitted their name to run for any position. The entire neighborhood was too disgusted with the HOA to want anything to do with it. If nobody ran, the HOA would have no board at all. That would mean no one to handle basic neighborhood maintenance or enforce the few legitimate rules that actually mattered. I said that was unfortunate, but I definitely wasn't going to run. Cheryl agreed she wasn't either. She said she'd been thinking about a neighbor named Hope Richmond who might be willing to do it. Hope was quiet and responsible. She'd lived in the neighborhood for 8 years and never caused any problems. Cheryl wanted to ask if I'd support Hope if she agreed to run. I said sure. Cheryl said she'd go talk to Hope that evening. The next day, Cheryl called to say Hope had reluctantly agreed to run for interim president. She'd only do it for 1 year while they rebuilt trust and rewrote the bylaws. She didn't want to be in charge long term, but she felt someone responsible needed to step up. I told Cheryl that was great news. Cheryl said Hope would need help understanding the actual HOA rules and creating a plan to fix everything. She asked if I'd be willing to meet with Hope a few times to explain what I'd learned. I said yes, even though I was already overwhelmed with coordinating the victim group. I spent the next 2 weeks meeting with Hope at her house almost every evening. She'd printed out the entire HOA bylaws document and highlighted sections she didn't understand. We went through it page by page. Most of the actual rules were reasonable. The problems had come from Davidson making up violations that didn't exist and using his authority to harass people. Hope wanted to create a system where no single person could issue fines without approval from at least 2 other board members. She also wanted to require photo evidence for any violation and give homeowners 2 weeks to fix problems before any fine was charged. We wrote up a proposal outlining all her ideas for reform. She was nervous about presenting it at the election meeting, but I could tell she genuinely cared about fixing the broken system. I found myself actually caring about the community too, even though I'd spent months trying to avoid my neighbors. These people had been through something terrible together. They deserved leadership that would protect them instead of exploiting them. Hope asked me if I'd consider running for a board position too. I told her absolutely not, but I'd help her however else she needed. Raphael called with another update. The forensic accountant he'd hired named Leroy Gaines had finished going through Gerald and Selena's financial records. He'd found evidence that both of them had received payments from Davidson that were labeled as consulting fees. Gerald had gotten $23,000 over 18 months. Selena had received $22,000 during the same period. The payments always came right after large batches of fake fines were issued. Leroy's analysis showed the payments were clearly bribes to keep Gerald and Selena quiet about the fraud. They'd known what Davidson and Williams were doing and had taken money to stay silent. Detective Morse had enough evidence now to charge them both as accessories to the fraud. He'd already gotten arrest warrants approved. I asked Raphael where Gerald and Selena were now. He said that was the interesting part. Detective Morse had sent officers to their houses that morning. Both houses were empty. Neighbors reported seeing them loading suitcases into their cars late the previous night. Detective Morse had put out alerts at airports and border crossings. He thought they were trying to run. I asked if they'd get away. Raphael said probably not. Running made them look guilty and gave law enforcement even more reason to pursue them aggressively. Sure enough, Detective Morse called me that evening to say both Gerald and Selena had been picked up trying to cross into Mexico at a border checkpoint in Texas. They were being held pending extradition back to face charges. I updated my spreadsheet again and sent the news to all 43 victims. Several people responded thanking me for keeping them informed. Maria wrote back saying this was the first good news she'd heard in months. The election meeting was packed. Every seat in the community center was taken, and people lined the walls. Hope stood at the front looking pale and nervous. She was the only person who'd submitted their name to run. The HOA bylaws said that if only one person ran for a position, they won by default. But Hope had insisted on giving a speech anyway explaining her plans for reform. She read from the proposal we'd written together. Her voice shook at first but got stronger as she went on. She talked about creating transparency and accountability. She explained the new system where multiple board members would have to approve any fine. She promised to abolish all pending violation notices that had been issued under Davidson's leadership. When she finished, the room was silent for a few seconds. Then someone started clapping. Within seconds, everyone was applauding. People stood up. The applause got louder. Hope's face turned red, but she smiled. The vote was unanimous. Hope became the new interim HOA president. Her first official act was exactly what she'd promised. She declared all pending fines void and announced that any future enforcement would require photo evidence and a transparent review process. The community center erupted in applause again. People were cheering. Several came up to shake Hope's hand and thank her. Cheryl hugged me and said we'd actually done something good. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. It might have been hope. The real kind, not just the name. Raphael called 3 weeks later with news about the settlement negotiations. Williams agreed to surrender the $35,000 still in her accounts, plus whatever money came from selling her house. Gerald and Selena decided to forfeit their $45,000 rather than face longer prison sentences. Raphael walked me through the numbers over the phone. We recovered $80,000 total against the $340,000 that got stolen. It felt like almost nothing. I asked if that was really the best we could do. Raphael explained that Davidson gambled away most of the money, and tracking down offshore accounts could take years with no guarantee of success. The victims needed something now, not promises of maybe getting more money 5 years from now. I understood his reasoning, but it still burned, knowing Davidson destroyed people's savings, and we could only recover 24 cents on every dollar stolen. The prosecutor called me 2 days after that. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to give a victim impact statement at Davidson's sentencing hearing. I agreed immediately, then spent the next week regretting it. I wrote the statement on a Tuesday night, and it came out sounding whiny and dramatic. I rewrote it Wednesday morning to focus more on facts and less on feelings, but then it sounded cold and detached, like I didn't care. Thursday's version mentioned how I couldn't sleep for weeks after finding him on my property at 2 a.m., but reading it back made me sound paranoid. Friday, I deleted everything and started over. I wanted the judge to understand that Davidson made me afraid in my own home without making it sound like I was exaggerating for sympathy. Saturday's draft focused on the security cameras I installed and how I checked them obsessively every morning, terrified of what I might find. Sunday, I read it to Cheryl and she cried, which made me think maybe it was too emotional again. Monday morning, I went back to the Friday version and changed 3 words. Tuesday, I changed them back.